I was reading a story this week about a young boy, about 3 years old. He was in a worship service in church, probably similar to one like this. He was sitting on his mother's lap, and he was being very quiet and well-behaved, kind of paying attention to everything, but kind of being as little 3-year-old boys are, looking around and letting his eyes wander and his mind wander. And then all of a sudden, it was time for communion, and the pastor held up the bread, and with great exuberance and joy, the little 3-year-old boy said extremely loudly, "Hello, Jesus!" And the pastor looked at this little boy with this great look of disapproval, and everyone else looked at this little boy, and he could tell all eyes were on him, and as little 3-year-old boys do when all eyes are on them, he said again, "Hello, Jesus!" People were shocked. This wasn't part of the liturgy. How inappropriate. This poor mother was holding her little kid, wondering, oh my gosh, are we even welcome here in this church? And as I was reading this story, I thought, maybe a little out of the ordinary, maybe a little inappropriate to tradition, but I had to give this little boy credit for taking Jesus seriously. Apparently, his mother had told him, well, when we hold up the bread in church, or when the pastor holds up the bread, that's Jesus. Well, the boy took that literally, and he couldn't wait to welcome Jesus and all that was involved with Jesus. And I thought, what a lesson for all of us to learn. Because I think in today's churches, as well as in our society, we don't always take Jesus seriously. And there's one way in particular that I was thinking about in terms of how we don't always take Jesus seriously. As I was reading through both our Old Testament lesson about the manna that came down from heaven, as well as Jesus in our gospel lesson who said, "I am the bread of life," sometimes we don't take that very seriously. In fact, throughout the entire scriptures, there's this theme that is recurring over and over and over, beginning in the opening chapters of Genesis and going all the way through about this incredible, wonderful, diverse world that God has made with so much sustenance and resources and abundance for everybody. And how we get to eat every single day. And how we get to share every single day. Now, many of you have heard me say this before, but I love words. I like looking at words and figuring out what they mean now and what they used to mean and patterns and how often they happen in various places throughout the Bible. And so, while I'm sure many of you were at the beach playing, I was home looking at words that were in today's gospel lesson, just having the time of my life. I decided to look up the word bread. And do you know that in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bread is mentioned almost 60 times. I didn't know that. I knew it was mentioned a lot, but I thought, well, I wonder how that compares to other words that we think of as very important in the Gospels. And so just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I started looking up some other words like forgiveness. You know, bread is mentioned more than forgiveness. Bread is also mentioned more than holiness. Bread is mentioned more than prayer. Bread is mentioned more than righteousness. I could go on and on. And it occurred to me that bread and food must have been very, very important. If Jesus mentioned them so much, and if the gospel writers many years later remembered Jesus teaching on prayer, on bread, and all the times that bread came up in the Gospels. So I was having fun just looking at all these words, thinking there's got to be a word out there that's mentioned more than bread? And I thought, I've got it. It's love. And actually, love is mentioned, I think, close to 80 times. So love is actually mentioned more than bread. And then I thought, bread is actually a synonym for food in many places in the gospel. So I combined a search for bread and food. And do you know that bread and food are mentioned more than love? Who knew? So as you were playing at the beach, I was just going, oh, eureka, I discovered something new in the Gospels that I didn't know before. But it really kind of took me aback a little bit, because I thought, you know what? Love and bread are just mentioned over and over and over and over and over and over again in the Gospels. And yet when I think about in our society and in our world how many hungry people are out there, there is something wrong. I did a little research this week just trying to figure out what the world hunger problem is really like, and I was blown away by how many hungry people are out there in the world. Partly because they don't have bread or food, partly because of the structures of their governments or societies are such that certain people have 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times more bread than they need, and others just don't have enough. When I thought about how many Christians there are in the world, and I realized after doing a little bit of research that approximately 30%, almost a third, of the entire population of the world profess to be Christians, I had to ask myself, then why is there so much hunger? If you think about it, if bread and love were two of the most important things that Jesus talked about, because he mentioned them over and over again, and two of the most important things for the gospel writers because they mentioned them over and over again, and we have so many Christians, 2 billion or so in the world, why do we still have so much hunger? I was reading about children in the United States who are hungry or considered undernourished. Something like 13 million. And then I was thinking, well, and it's even worse in developing countries. In fact, I found one statistic that said every 10 seconds, a child dies of hunger somewhere in the world. And as we sit in our worship service, praying and singing and dancing, from the time we start our worship until the time we walk out of here, 450 children will have died of hunger or malnutrition. Are we taking the words of Jesus seriously? Not as seriously as we should be. When I listen to many of the loud voices out there of religious people in our country, both people that are pastors of large churches as well as people who are involved in government who say very clearly, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus. I look at what they talk about and I listen to what they talk about. And there are so many topics that come up regularly, and I'm not saying these are bad topics, but I hear quite a bit about abortion, homosexuality, prayer in schools, the rights of people to bear arms who are gun owners, and on and on. And I think, Jesus didn't mention any of these things even once. That might surprise you. Abortion's not mentioned once by Jesus. Homosexuality is not mentioned once. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about these things. I think it's good to talk about things and figure out what it is that we disagree on and be nice to each other about it. And it's important that anything that's on our minds that is bothering us, we're able to talk about. But if we talk about all those things with such passion and such fervor that we totally miss the things that Jesus talked about the most, then I have to say we're not taking Jesus very seriously. And what might we do as individuals, as a church, and a society to take Jesus more seriously? Well, as I was reading this morning's gospel lesson throughout the week, it occurred to me that when Jesus said, "I am the bread of life, whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty," there are certain things that he did not say that I think we just assume he said. Jesus did not say, if you believe these certain sets of doctrines and guidelines and dogmas, then you'll never be hungry or thirsty. Jesus didn't say that. Or if you believe in this certain way of running your church, then you will be never hungry or thirsty. Jesus didn't say that. Or if there's a certain way to structure your government, or if you vote for this kind of person, Jesus said, if you believe in me. In other words, who Jesus was being, not just what he was saying, but who was he in the world? I love how Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book, Altar in the World, talks about how she pays attention as she's reading the Gospels to who Jesus is being. Not just what he's saying, but who he's being. And she says that it's fascinating to watch the pace of which Jesus went about the world in his ministry. She said, I'm sure he could have gotten a horse, or at least a donkey. He did that once. He could have done it again. But Jesus tended to walk. According to Barbara Brown Taylor, Jesus not only walked everywhere intentionally, but he walked everywhere intentionally, if you know what I mean. He paid attention. He looked and saw things that many people never saw, which were right in front of them. Jesus saw poor people that were overlooked by others. He saw hungry people. He saw people who had deep, deep longings and needs. He saw birds, sparrows. He saw grains of wheat. He saw mustard seeds. You know how small those are. If I held one up, you wouldn't even be able to see it from where you're sitting. Jesus saw flowers. And you know I like that part about him, right? But Jesus had this way about him, according to Barbara Brown Taylor, where he would actually look at a person and he would see that person in a way that nobody else would see. That's who Jesus was being in the world. When he said, I am the bread of life, whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty, he wasn't talking about a set of doctrine, stated beliefs that you have to believe in. Yes, there are some good things, some very good things that we do believe as Christians, and I'm not knocking that at all. But sometimes we get so caught up in what we're supposed to believe that we forget to look at who Jesus was being. And when we do that, we forget, I think, to look at who we are being as followers of Jesus. I wonder if we were being intentional about not only the pace with which we walk through this world, but also intentional about looking and being aware of all the things that we may have missed. I wonder how much more we would see, especially when we look at other people. Mother Teresa once said, there are Calcuttas everywhere. When somebody went to Calcutta and said, well, no wonder you have so much to do. Look around you. Her point was, you don't have to travel to the poorest slums of India to see people who have deep longing and needs. Just look around you, and guess what? Look within you. Because many of us have deep longings and needs, and because we're either so busy or embarrassed about them, we don't even acknowledge them. Well, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention to you that Jesus used bread not only literally, in other words, take this bread and go feed people, but also metaphorically. And today's scripture, I think, is a great example of that when he said, I am the bread of life. You see, we do, as human beings, have deep longings. There are some of us, I'm sure, that are in church today that are just longing for somebody that's not with them anymore. Some of us have longings for people who have passed on. Some of us have longings for people who have moved away, or they were here and now they're gone. We have longings. Some of us are longing for deeper community. Some of us are just longing for somebody to say, I love you just the way you are. You don't have to look very far to find people who are not only hungry physically, but starving on the inside, figuratively speaking. And Jesus was there for all kinds of hunger. And Jesus calls us to open our eyes, to look, to pay attention, to be aware of all the hunger that's all around us and within us, and to come before him and say, feed me. And how might I feed those around me who are also hungry? In a few moments, we have a song, and then we're going to participate in Holy Communion. And today, as you prepare your hearts for communion, I invite you to consider where your longings are and how Jesus might feed you, and also to think about the people in your life, maybe family members or neighbors or people down the street who have deep, deep, deep longings, and what it is that they might need. And it might just be someone saying, I'm here for you. I love you. You're perfect just the way you are. I think if we take Jesus seriously, and a little boy in church ever says, hello, Jesus, when the pastor lifts up the communion bread, we won't be offended. In fact, I think we will take Jesus seriously and welcome any time or place another human being recognizes Jesus and says, hello, Jesus. God bless you.